As languages change, many lament the loss of that particular language in its original form. While language change is very common, there's a fine line between a language evolving and a language disappearing altogether. This is seen in Shanghai, China, where the prominent dialect, Shanghainese, was once widely spoken, only to be almost entirely replaced by Mandarin. With many calling for reforms to reintroduce the language to those living there, questions and concerns about loss and authenticity are commonly raised. But first, let's talk about languages as a whole. All languages are classed, firstly, into families, then branches, then groups, and then there are smaller classifications such as individual languages, as the general public might think of them, dialects and subdialects. This notion of language and dialect is, in the case of any language, particularly hard to define. Languages and their corresponding dialects are societally constructed, and depending on social, political, and cultural factors, what puts a way of speech into one of the two categories can vary. Consider English and its many dialects. Some we understand quite easily, like a standard English accent.
And we're going to look at British Standard English.
Or a Scottish accent.
Today's lesson, I'm going to teach you the Scots tongue.
These dialects are mutually intelligible with their own standard American English accent. This means they're so similar that speakers of each could understand one another with relative ease. But there are other accents that are a lot harder to understand. Take this interview, for instance.
Oh God, it's desperate going. The mountains is brave and close now, right enough. Oh God, it's wild time of the snow, all right.
It doesn't put you off from going to school.
Well, the mother says we had to go anyway. We hadn't much a choice in the matter, but sure.
It's a cold journey to school this morning.
Oh God, you wouldn't be long getting frostbite.
Believe it or not, he's speaking English. It's just a dialect that isn't entirely mutually intelligible with our own. You might be able to pick up on parts of what he's saying, but it's definitely more difficult. There are also entire languages that are mutually intelligible with one another. For instance, Hindi and Urdu are mutually intelligible despite being different languages. This is for mainly political and religious reasons. Hindi is one of the official languages of India, while Urdu is the official language of Pakistan. The main differences between them are that Hindi uses Sanskrit script while Urdu uses Arabic, and they're simply called two different languages. Without going into the politics of Pakistan and India, I can say that, like India and Pakistan, both languages come from the same background. So much so that many simply call Hindi and Urdu Hindustani. Over time, as the regions divided, so did Hindustani. And so we were left with two separate languages that are almost entirely the same. But this isn't the only instance where common notions of languages are challenged. German is spoken in both Germany and Switzerland. Those from central Germany might have a harder time understanding those from central Switzerland. Yet those living on the border of each country could probably easily converse. Now let's talk about Chinese. Chinese is divided into multiple groups with subcategories that aren't always mutually intelligible, and yet these subcategories aren't technically classified as separate languages, but as dialects. Of course, we've learned this isn't entirely uncommon, but I do want to simply highlight that China's dialects all fall within the Sino-Tibetan family and the Sinitic branch within this family. But classification further than that is often questioned, especially compared to other languages in the Tibetan branch of the family, which can be quite easily broken down into groups and mutually unintelligible indigenous languages, such as Burmese or Lhasa or Standard Tibetan, which we won't go in detail about. Every group and dialect that falls under the Sinitic branch is usually just classified as the Chinese language. This classification is important in understanding the Shanghainese dialect because features of Shanghainese and other Chinese dialect more closely resemble what many would classify as a language. And while we understand that the lines between language and dialect are blurred, it's accurate to say that every dialect of Chinese has its own unique vocabulary, grammar, and even writing system if you consider the fact that, while the same characters are used, different meanings are assigned to them depending on the dialect you're reading or writing. Let's look at some specific differences between Shanghainese and Mandarin. Firstly, Mandarin is the lingua franca of China. The easiest way to think about the concept of a lingua franca is that it's so widely spoken and understood that two speakers in a particular region, regardless of their native language, would more than likely be able to use the lingua franca to communicate. For instance, English is currently the global lingua franca for business, science, entertainment, and technology. In China's case, Mandarin is not only the most commonly spoken language, but it's also the official language of China. It's used in politics, taught in schools, and it's becoming the first language, specifically dialect, of even children born in areas that historically speak other dialects. Both Shanghainese and Mandarin are tonal languages. This means different pitches of syllables create different words, even if the syllables are technically the same. Here's an example.
This is the word for telephone. First in Mandarin,
电话
next in Cantonese,
電話
in Shanghainese,
底屋
and in Hakka.
天發
While Mandarin only has these 4 tones, Shanghainese has 5. Here's an example from a Shanghainese speaker, Ashley Ding. Said the sentence in Mandarin like, 你好，我叫 Skylar. Like, hello, my name is Skylar. What would that be in Shanghainese for just a comparison?
侬好，我叫 Skylar.
Going back to Mandarin and Shanghainese, initials, or the first part of Chinese syllables, can be voiced in Shanghainese, as opposed to in Mandarin, in which all initials are unvoiced.
波坡摸佛
I think it's especially important to demonstrate these specific differences between Shanghainese and Mandarin to give insight into the major shift that occurred in China when Mandarin became the dominant dialect, as seen by its wide usage throughout the region, leaving Shanghainese and smaller dialects with a dwindling number of native speakers. To put it all together, most dialects of the Chinese language are not mutually intelligible, and changes to any Chinese dialect mean changes to what many English speakers believe to be an entire language. Therefore, when talking about our focus dialect, Shanghainese, and how less people are speaking it, concerns about the extinction of an entire language can be raised. Now, let's talk about some of the history of Shanghainese itself, as well as how Mandarin became more commonplace amongst those who, otherwise, would continue primarily speaking the local dialect. 150 years before Mandarin became China's standard dialect, Shanghainese was used prevalently due to Shanghai being a prominent port city to which immigration from smaller, surrounding areas was common. And because of that, Shanghai is now huge. Though its landmass isn't particularly large compared to other Chinese cities like Beijing, Shanghai is about the size of Delaware, whereas Beijing's land area is relatively equivalent to New Jersey. Shanghai is currently the 3rd largest city in the world by population, and approximately 14 million people speak the language. But let me put it in context. There are about 1 million Mandarin speakers in the world. So that 14 million is still a lot smaller by comparison. Also, it's only half of the 28 million people that live there. In Shanghai, where Shanghainese originated and is most widely spoken, only half of the population speaks the dialect. Despite these differences, the notion of language purity should also be considered. And this is where the idea of population of speakers can become more complicated. Even what is now considered pure Shanghainese was, at the time, undergoing many changes due to outside linguistic influence. Historically, when Shanghai's population increase first began, immigrants and their children adopted Shanghainese as their primary language. And yet, Shanghainese itself has also slightly evolved, even during that time period, to include features from surrounding dialects. Looking at language in this way, the idea of authenticity due to popularity of a standardized version is controversial. While Mandarin has technically been China's official language since the Qing dynasty in 1644, during that time many dialects continued to be spoken. In 1912, when the Qing dynasty fell, the Republic of China maintained Mandarin as the official language. And in 1955, when China had established the People's Republic of China, the Beijing variant of Mandarin, specifically Putonghua, was promoted as China's standard dialect, and therefore became the official language used in schools and became more commonly used in mass media and public business. This was further solidified in 1982, in the PRC's 4th and current constitution, when Putonghua was established at the highest level of China's legal system. Despite this, according to Fang Xu, lecturer at the University of California and the author of the novel Silencing Shanghai, language and identity in urban China, Shanghainese only started to decline in the late 1990s when the Chinese government implemented economic reform for globalization and developmental policies meant to globalize Shanghai. But this is another area where the lines can be a bit blurred, as no matter exactly when Mandarin became more prominent in Shanghai, the government specifically implemented Putonghua, or Standard Mandarin. You see, as a dialect, Mandarin can be divided up further into multiple categories such as Northeastern Mandarin, Southwestern Mandarin, and Middle Mandarin. Some Chinese speakers will say they're the same, but there are others who say they believe the dialects to be very different. For right now, I think it's important just to know that there is technically a distinction between the Putonghua version of Mandarin the Chinese government promotes and other varieties of Mandarin. Just like in English, there's a distinction between different variations of the Southern dialect we so often hear. Ironically, just like the Shanghainese dialect, there's also debate about the American Southern accent being in decline. According to the Ministry of Education of the People's Republic of China, Mandarin continues to be promoted. In the Law on the Standard Spoken and Written Chinese Language of the People's Republic of China, Article 1 says, the normalization and standardization of the standard spoken and written Chinese language. And Article 10 clearly states that Putonghua, Mandarin, and the standardized Chinese characters shall be used as the basic language in education and teaching in schools and other institutions of education, except where otherwise provided for in laws. Despite this, I thought it would be important to point out that Cantonese, another Chinese dialect, is still widely used. In Hong Kong, 88.9% of the population considers Cantonese their usual dialect, and in Macau, 85.7% of the population consider Cantonese their common dialect. Cantonese is also used in a lot of advertisements, despite being a local dialect. Of course, there are a lot of potential reasons for this, mainly due to the history of Hong Kong not being considered a part of mainland China for decades, along with Hong Kong's current status as a special administrative region of China, where it abides by the one country, two systems principle, essentially giving Hong Kong an executive-led governing system independent of China's national government. Though Hong Kong's governing system still abides by Putonghua Mandarin being China's official language, and therefore Hong Kong's official language, they also have their own biliteracy and trilingualism policy that promotes Cantonese and English alongside Putonghua. This was an interesting comparison to the lesser-known Shanghainese, which, according to people in Shanghai, is actually being phased out.
啥问题啊？啥问题啊？啥问题啊？像那居委会呢，跟人家居民打交道，就到人家屋里去打交道，侪不讲普通闲话，不讲上海话。为啥呢？伊听不懂呀。就是伊跟我讲闲话，伊讲侬跟我讲上海话，我做啥？不要被人听懂。
Though this is an unfortunate example of language loss, it's not uncommon. As languages, or in this case dialects, become less relevant in education, business, and less common in surrounding areas, they also become less relevant in everyday life. This idea ties into a concept known as social capital, which refers to social ties that can give an individual or a group of individuals advantages and disadvantages. In China, speaking Putonghua Mandarin has become a source of social capital that is linked to unity, patriotism, and social and economic upward mobility. This is further outlined in the China Dream, a slogan associated with Xi Jinping, the current General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and China's paramount leader. The China Dream is, essentially, Xi Jinping's overall plan to rejuvenate the nation, and a major part of this plan includes a high promotion of Putonghua so that Chinese citizens can gain more social capital. So much so that the China Dream, including the implementation of Putonghua within it, doesn't just state Putonghua should be spoken, but that it should be spoken well. The state-owned, party-run newspaper People's Daily also goes on to say, promoting Putonghua does not mean intentionally annihilating dialects, but to gradually limit their scope of use, which is in conformity with the objective rules of societal progress. Despite good intentions of not completely eliminating local dialects, for Shanghainese, this seems to be the case.
I know the young generation, less and less people speak Shanghainese, even though they are Shanghainese, they don't want to speak Shanghainese, maybe because of in school when they were spending a lot of time studying, the school has a rule that all the teachers and students have to speak Mandarin instead of Shanghainese, because maybe it makes some people feel discriminated if everybody speaks Shanghainese, but he or she couldn't understand it. So that's why they were in a Mandarin setting. So that's why they just more and more reluctant to speak Shanghainese. Yes, one of my colleagues, she is Shanghainese, but whenever we were together, she never speaks Shanghainese to me. Yeah.
Ashley also talked about how Shanghainese, in particular social context in Shanghai, can also be a form of social capital of its own.
Of course, I hope everybody speaks Shanghainese. That's kind of like close. It makes me feel better because it makes me feel belonging to this place that I was born. I wasn't born here, but I was raised up there. So I feel like I'm Shanghainese. I hope everybody speaks Shanghainese. It's just give me a sense of like belonging.
Despite there being social capital in these smaller circles, the Chinese government seems to be largely trying to implement systems where the most social capital is to be found in speaking Putonghua. Another factor that has contributed to the endangerment of the dialect is large-scale urban developments that have displaced millions of native Shanghainese speakers from once heavily populated inner-city neighborhoods. This has caused residents to be sorted into neighborhoods solely according to economic status, which has caused previously linguistically homogeneous areas to be broken up. According to Silencing Shanghai's Fang Xu, this geographical displacement and relocation of Shanghai dialect speakers in the last 3 decades have disrupted the regular and frequent interactions which are essential for the maintenance and survival of a speech community. Overall, this is causing the number of those who might be able to proficiently speak Putonghua and Shanghainese to diminish. Along with this geographic displacement, linguistic homogeny is further disrupted by intermarriage of native and non-native Shanghainese people. This is an effect that is often seen in immigrant families, even those in the United States. A typical scenario is the grandparents' generation moves to a new country, fluent in the language of the nation or area from which they came. Their children, raised primarily or entirely in the new country, can usually speak a little of their parents' native language, and this can fluctuate depending on factors like personal and societal attitudes toward their heritage language, and necessity of speaking it, such as helping translate for parents, family, or community members, as well as social capital. But no matter what, usually this second-generation vocabulary isn't as advanced as their parents. By the 3rd generation, the original native language their grandparents were fluent in is commonly lost. In Shanghai, we see this, just in reverse. Instead of people moving, Mandarin is moving, and Shanghainese is being displaced.
你
侬是不是上海人？
我觉得这个真的很难。
那肯定想问我一个问题，我为啥会得讲上海话呢？
Despite the social capital tied to Putonghua, primary schools in Shanghai are making a greater effort to teach children Shanghainese, mentioning a weekly optional course at Jing'an Primary School to teach Shanghai's history, dialect, folklore, and culture, and a campaign called Shanghai Day at Modern Baby Kindergarten held on Fridays, which involves a Shanghai-style breakfast, learning Shanghai dialect ballads, and playing native Shanghai games. 14 people from Shanghai were selected to contribute to recordings of Shanghainese. According to the Shanghai Daily reporting on it, these volunteers were chosen on the merits of having a pure accent and idiomatic expressions. They were asked to read the Aesop fable The North Wind and the Sun in both Mandarin and Shanghainese, as well as pronounce Chinese characters in Shanghainese. According to Emily Hughes' Endangered Languages, Rescuing the World's Invisible Libraries, 13 recruitment sites for Shanghainese speakers were also set up to aid in this language preservation process. Of these sites, only 2 found pure speakers, or those who speak closest to a more historical way of speaking Shanghainese. Though, as previously mentioned, this idea of language purity can be up for debate, especially regarding a language or dialect in Shanghai's case that has been linguistically influenced for generations. This notion of preserved Shanghainese is almost like when English speakers wanted to get rid of borrowed words like muscle and use inkhorn terms like flesh string. Overall, these Shanghainese preservation efforts not only show how the dialect, as it was most widely spoken in the past, is becoming closer to being extinct, but also simply how the dialect is changing. Though this doesn't mean preservation efforts are wrong. I talked more with Ashley Ding for her view on this.
The most important is just to remove the rule of speaking only Mandarin in school, because our young generation is reluctant to speak Shanghainese because they couldn't just blend in if they speak Shanghainese. Because so many people, the peer pressure, maybe a lot of people, students around them, they just don't speak Shanghainese. So they are more likely to speak Mandarin instead of Shanghainese, and they don't have the setting, except at home. At home, their parents may speak Shanghainese to them. But now, since so many immigrants immigrate to Shanghai, so a lot of Shanghainese just married non-Shanghainese. So their family, they will speak Mandarin. So that's one of the reasons why Shanghainese was kind of diminishing. So one of the way I think is just to remove the regulation that you have to speak Mandarin at school. I think it's better if you can just set up a class, like a Shanghainese class. Everybody can attend if you're interested, to preserve the language. And I hope it could become true. It can be true. It can be a new rule, a new class, a new course added to the curriculum.
This brings about a discussion about language extinction versus language evolution. Essentially, all languages change over time, English included. And though many are typically reluctant to see certain changes come about, this change is inevitable, and it can be a lot more nuanced than the differences between Old, Middle, Early Modern, and Modern English. Overall, based on how we've come to view English, another way at looking at the situation in China is not that dialects are dying, but that they're evolving because of Mandarin's influence. In the project Hugh mentions that recruited Shanghainese speakers, 14 million people claimed to speak Shanghainese. It was those facilitating the recruitment sites and recruitment process as a whole that deemed the volunteer Shanghainese to be too impure to be used as an example. Though I believe preservation of older linguistic conventions is important, I'd also like to explore the alternate idea of a new, modern Shanghainese that is being developed in front of us all. Along with my research, I wanted to get even more opinions from native Chinese speakers. The first person I was able to ask was a member of UAB's Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, and my Chinese professor, Ling Ma. She told me she personally believes that dialect education in China is declining due to less job opportunities and language barriers between speakers of Mandarin and dialect speakers. In addition to Professor Ma, I was able to get even more input from Ashley Ding. Would a Mandarin speaker be able to understand a Shanghainese speaker?
If they are in this language setting frequent often enough, like if they are in this setting for a few months, they will get it. They will get it, for at some point. Like my husband, he was from Hunan province. At first he totally didn't understand Shanghainese, but for a few times when I talked to my mom, my brother, just a few times, like some hours, when he listened to it, he started to get it.
I think it's so important to recognize the linguistic situation in China right now. Studying how Shanghainese is changing can allow us to learn a lot more about Chinese society and history, which is so powerful because it impacts the United States and many other nations to this day. whether it be through cultural exchange, trade, or even political diplomacy, because communication and an understanding of culture is valuable in any of these aspects. In addition to this, learning about the linguistic situation in Shanghai can give insight into how lingua francas all over the world can change, and it can help us understand more about how English has evolved and will continue to evolve over time as we, ourselves, become influenced by factors like immigration, new rules about standard English being implemented into schools and businesses, younger generations perpetuating new norms, and mass media making changes more well-known. Overall, I think this focus on Shanghainese can greatly contribute to an ongoing linguistic conversation about the history of and changes that can occur in all languages and dialects in our growing, multicultural, and modern society.